For me personally, I always find it very important that every person that you choose to associate in life with, whether it be in relationships, friendships, family, workplace, what have you, business, so on, that you should always go into that situation with the mindset of trying to learn something from everybody, whether it be something bad or something good. Now, sometimes it can be really powerful to learn from the bad, learn from people's mistakes, figure out how they made those mistakes, why they made those mistakes, what caused those mistakes, and be determined to take those steps to not repeat that other person's mistakes because you can see the impact that it had on their lives. And that could be a very powerful motivating tool, especially for us as human beings, because at the end of the day, like I've said before, we tend to be very negative in nature. We tend to gravitate towards negativity. So it's easier to be upset or angry than it is positive. So it's easier to focus on bad things and then try to not repeat those bad things, those bad moves, those bad decisions. And when we talk about the NFL, when I talk about teams like the Cleveland Browns, Jacksonville Jaguars, Chicago Bears, so on, you know, we can learn things from how they do things and how it's not the right thing to do and why. But then on the flip side, sometimes I think you can also learn from good that people do, good decisions, good choices that people make. And you could try to emulate them and try to learn from them and take what they do and try to make it your own, try to make it better. And that could be a very powerful way to go through life. It can sometimes require more effort, believe it or not, but the payoff can be really, really worth it. And every bit as satisfying as learning from somebody's past mistakes outside of just your own. But again, it can be important to learn from those positives. And the one thing I will say for the Atlanta Falcons is that they were rewarded for their patience, because patience really is a virtue. And you've heard the old saying that good things come to those who wait. But this organization deserves a lot of credit because they were at a point in time where they fired Mike Smith. Frankly, they were at a position where they could have completely shit canned Thomas Dimitroff too, but they didn't. There was some shifting in roles and responsibilities, so on, to a degree. But at the end of the day, they kind of stayed the course there. Then you get to the 2014 season, after they fired Mike Smith, the Falcons identify their guy. It's Dan Quinn. And give these sons of a guns credit. They stuck to their guns and they stayed patient. Where other organizations would rush to fill a position and say, we just got to find a guy, let's go get a guy, we can't risk it. The Atlanta Falcons, maybe they already had an agreement in place with Dan Quinn and they were just waiting, so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, they stayed patient. They waited. It was more important for them to get the right guy than the first guy. And there are some organizations that could learn that very valuable lesson. And I think that was a very important moment in the history of the Atlanta Falcons organization because you can clearly point to the fact that Dan Quinn has come in 2 years. It really changed the entire vibe around the Atlanta Falcons organization, changed the culture of the Atlanta Falcons organization, and frankly has made them, honestly, now, based off of what happened in 2016, more relevant than they ever have been. Going back to the Dirty Bird Falcons of '98, going back to the Michael Vick fucking days. This is the most prominent the Falcons organization has ever been. And not only that, they are in a position where they could potentially be prominent for several years to come. And again, when we talk about learning from good choices and good decisions and good moves that good NFL teams have made that put them in a position, I think it's important to take a look at why the Atlanta Falcons ultimately got to the position that they were in. Number one, I think in a lot of ways it ties all the way back to drafting Matt Ryan in 2008. You can sit there and talk about how easy of a slam dunk pick that was, but in 2008, I assure you that wasn't. I remember Mike Mayock getting a ton of shit from a lot of people because of some of his allegiances to Boston College and the perceptions of he was sitting there and trying to pump up smoke about Matt Ryan's draft stock and his abilities because he had a relationship with Matt Ryan and his family and so on and so forth. Also at that time, this was coming off of the heels of the Michael Vick crap. On top of that, you had a situation where two other teams were picking ahead of the Falcons that year, and they chose to draft in the Dolphins, Jake Long, and the St. Louis Rams, Chris Long, respectively. And on top of that, the Falcons got a lot of heat that day, if you remember, for plenty of commentators in the NFL And I remember Steve Young being one of the most positive proponents for this Matt Ryan drafting, and most everybody else on the set really didn't understand it because they could have drafted somebody like a Glenn Dorsey. Imagine that. But it was the fact that the Atlanta Falcons got it right with their quarterback, and they found their franchise guy to build around. Because I assure you, if they didn't take Matt Ryan that day, they might never be in this position, and who knows what we'd be saying about this Falcons team over the recent years. Then you look at the fact in 2011, they identified Julio Jones as a difference maker. They already had Roddy White from draft before, going even before Matt Ryan, but they wanted a difference maker outside. They wanted a dude that would take their offense in the passing game to another level, that would help Matt Ryan. You build around Matt Ryan because he's your franchise dude. So they give up a bunch of picks to go up and get Julio Jones. They go from 27 all the way up to number 6. And the Cleveland Browns made that deal because the Cleveland Browns are who they are, and the Atlanta Falcons, in part, made that deal because they are who they are, and that's why they made it to the Super Bowl. Now, granted, you could talk about some of the potential blowback were in terms of some of the subsequent drafting in 11, in the particular 12, and that it didn't put them in a great position. But long term, would you pay that price to get a Julio Jones, a future potential Hall of Fame dude? The answer is absolutely yes. Sometimes it's great to have a number of picks. Sometimes it's great to get a number of dudes. But sometimes it's nice to get that dude. And you look at that moment in time, that was a huge risk for the organization, but man, has that paid off so much. But you also look, I think, at recent first-round selections. Even though he didn't finish the season healthy, Desmond Trufant has been a nice player for them, coming out of that 2013 weak-ass draft class. You look at guys like Jake Matthews in 2014, Vic Beasley in 2015, even Keanu Neal, who a lot of people, myself included, thought was a bit of a reach in round 1. You look at those last 4 first-round picks, Desmond Trufant, Jake Matthews, Vic Beasley, Keanu Neal. Desmond Trufant became a number 1 corner. Jake Matthews became the blindside protector for Matt Ryan. Sam Baker, he's not. Vic Beasley led the league in sacks. Keanu Neal made a difference in that secondary. He was a presence. So the last 4 first-round picks, none of them have busted, and all of them have contributed. And they've been key contributors, not just guys on the roster. They're starters and quality starters. And when you go back to Julio Jones, you're talking about a team that has hit, and in some cases hit huge, on 5 of their past 6 first-round picks. They haven't missed on a first-round pick since, probably 2010. Think about that. When you have a team that consistently hits on their first-round pick like the Steelers had for many years, it bodes well for you enjoying success. The Panthers being another team that traditionally has hit pretty well on a lot of their first-round picks. It's why you end up in a certain position, because you capitalize on those marquee picks and you potentially get marquee players out of those picks. But then you look at some of the draft steals they've had in recent years. Grady Jarrett, former 5th-round pick. Deion Jones and Devondre Campbell were 2nd and 4th-round picks in this past year's draft. Devontae Freeman, former 4th-round pick out of Florida State. Tevin Coleman, a former 3rd-round pick out of Indiana. I mean, those were some dudes that contributed. Starters, impact players for them, especially with their tandem of running backs in Devontae Freeman and Tevin Coleman. My goodness. They ended up teaming with Julio Jones. And when you look at free agency, you bring in Andy Levitre, you bring in Alex Mack, you bring in Mohamed Sanu, you bring in Taylor Gabriel, and all of a sudden what you've got is the best offense in the National Football League in 2016. Julio is going to Julio. Devontae Freeman and Tevin Coleman have great seasons. Matt Ryan is the league's most valuable player. There was a point in time where you looked at this team and, man, they were rolling. You thought that this team could actually win the Super Bowl. They won their last 4 in the regular season, which was tough, which is always tough to do. Then they blow out both Seattle and Green Bay in the playoffs. You look at the entirety of it. This is still a team with holes on both sides of the ball, especially defensively. But you look at the fact that you bring in Dan Quinn, you put a system in place, and you find the talent that fits that system. The Keanu Neals, the Deion Joneses, the Devondre Campbells, the Vic Beasleys. You get more out of guys like Desmond Trufant. You get more out of guys like Grady Jarrett. It's not hard to understand why the Falcons are in this position, because for years, even though it didn't always manifest that way, eventually it did manifest that these guys did quite a number of things right. So some of the criticism and knocking and hating on them, joke's on us. especially me. And it's funny too because going into this season, there were not great expectations for this team. I think some people probably picked them to win the division. Some people thought they maybe were a playoff team, but Super Bowl team and a team that could have the New England Patriots down 28-3 midway through the third quarter in Super Bowl 51. Give me a fucking break. And this was no matter what, this was a hell of a season for the Atlanta Falcons. And this could be a point in time where the Atlanta Falcons become a team that could, along with the Dallas Cowboys, maybe the Green Bay Packers, the Seahawks, and maybe one or two other teams, really be the creme de la creme of the NFC for the next 3 to 5 years. Because even if Matt Ryan doesn't play to an MVP level, you've still got a lot of talent on that offensive side of the ball. And if that defense gets any better, this is a team that even has more balance, is more complete, and is even scarier. But it may not be. Because what happened in Super Bowl 51 is the type of loss that can ruin organizations, that could set teams back years. Like you look at the Carolina Panthers just as one of many recent examples. You talk about a Super Bowl curse. The Super Bowl curse is for many years that teams that lose the Super Bowl one year don't make it back the next year. And that hasn't happened since the Bills of the 90s. But even more so, there have been plenty of times where the Super Bowl loser hasn't made it back to the playoffs the next year. And you even have instances where the Super Bowl champion doesn't make it back the next year. But you look at what happened with Carolina. This is a team that went into the Super Bowl 15-1. They were a more complete, more well-balanced team. They should have owned the Denver Broncos and dominated the Denver Broncos and made Peyton Manning glad that he was going to retire after the game. And that shit didn't happen. And especially when you look at how poorly Cam played, and especially not going after the fumble late in the game, it clearly had a mental impact on that team because even if you say, well, they lost Josh Norman in free agency, they really didn't lose much else. They even gained Kelvin Benjamin back from an ACL injury. The losing of that Super Bowl in that way was devastating for that organization. And if it was devastating for them, imagine how devastating it would be to lose a Super Bowl in record fashion, to give up the biggest lead or biggest comeback, in Super Bowl history. This is going to be a real measure for the quality of coach that Dan Quinn is, and the quality of organization that the Atlanta Falcons are, and the quality of players that this team has. Because in theory, this should be the type of loss that ruins an organization. And it frankly will take a lot for it to not permanently mindfuck this organization, period. But we talk about learning from the good and all the things that got the Falcons to the Super Bowl. We got to look at the bad too and learn about why they lost. Now, you'll hear some things about why they lost, talking about it was over an hour, after Brady threw the pick six, and the Patriots got the ball right back in the second quarter, and they drove the ball down, got a field goal before halftime. So it was basically over an hour between when the Falcons' offense touched the ball in the second quarter to when they did again in the third quarter. And there's a little something to that. You could say they lost some rhythm, but hell, even at that point in time, they're up 21-3. In the third quarter, it was the Falcons that scored a touchdown first. They were up 28-3. So I don't know how much that was to blame, but maybe that was part of it. A lot of people want to blame Kyle Shanahan and his play calling, talking about how ridiculous it was in the fourth quarter with the lead, that they weren't running the ball more, especially on 3rd and 1. But God damn it all. That's just such a narrow-minded approach to taking a look at what actually happened and trying to appropriately assess blame as to what ultimately led to this massive choke job, which is exactly what it was. Here's why I think the Atlanta Falcons lost Super Bowl 51. And I'm sure this will tick off some Falcons fans, but it's fucking the way I see it. It's my truth. You can call it alternative facts if you want, but if you think about it, I'm not that far off the mark. Number one, let's face it. They were going up against Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. A lot of teams have been in this position and not been so fortunate. Okay? You're not the only ones that it's happened to. And at the end of the day, especially in the Super Bowl, you're talking about a team that had already coming into this game been to 6 Super Bowls with Brady and Belichick, won 4 of them and lost 2 of them to the same team in the Giants, in large part because at the end of the day, they got miraculous catches from David Tyree after the 2007 season and freaking Mario Manningham after the 2011 season. Those are still close games. Those are still games that, without those fluke catches, the Patriots might have won. You could very easily be talking about a team that's won 6 Super Bowls. So the margin for error is very razor thin. In the Super Bowl, you have to play close to a perfect game to beat the New England Patriots and Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. You're talking about the greatest coach of all time, and I don't think there's any question about that. And to me, the greatest quarterback of all time. And I think at this point in time, especially with what happened in Super Bowl 51 and just the entirety of the career as a whole, to sit there and assert anything other than that is either living in past fantasy worlds about how guys are greater than what they actually were, or just more so trying to hate on Tom Brady. What more does the dude have to fucking do? I mean, so the fans could sit there and be like this and that, but damn it all, you had to play Brady and Belichick in the Super Bowl. That's a tough deal. But I look at what the Falcons did. And number one, everybody wants to talk about the running game and bitch about the lack of touches in the running game and the lack of commitment to the running game in the fourth quarter when you're trying to milk the clock and you're trying to control the game and you're trying to maintain a lead. No. Matt Ryan is the league's most valuable player. He's your franchise player. And your best player is fucking Julio Jones. What I find even more ridiculous is that Kyle Shanahan and Dan Quinn went into a Super Bowl with the league's MVP and their best player in Julio Jones and decided, especially early on after seeing that Julio was on the money, he was going to catch everything fucking thrown at him, and honestly he did, and that the New England Patriots couldn't defend him because frankly, even if you do a lot with Julio Jones, there are plenty of times you still can't defend him even if you double team him. Some dipshit along the way thought it was a good idea to make sure that Julio Jones only saw 4 targets the entire fucking game. And to me, this is a reflection of the stupidity of the NFL and coaches and coordinators sometimes in terms of getting too cute and overthinking shit. Thinking about matchups and situational football and so on and so forth. No, motherfucker, you've got Matt Ryan, you've got Julio Jones. I'm going to target Julio Jones until his fucking foot breaks or his wheels fall off. The fact that he didn't get a minimum of 10 targets, let alone 15, or God knows, in the biggest game of my life, I want Julio Jones to get 20 looks. I don't care if I've got to force him the ball because who could fucking defend him for New England? Nobody could that game. Instead of having 4 catches for 80 yards and a touchdown, this dude should have had like 12 catches for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns and had an all-time epic Jerry Rice level of Super Bowl performance. You want to talk about game plan? If you go to Julio Jones earlier and more consistently in the game, you don't have to worry about the inability or the lack of commitment to running the football in the fourth fucking quarter because it's not going to matter because you got 49 points up on the goddamn motherfucking board. How stupid is that? This whole traditional thing about you got to run in the fourth quarter. Devontae Freeman, Tevin Coleman had really good years. But if I'm trying to win the Super Bowl, I am putting the ball in Matt Ryan and as a consequence, Julio Jones' fucking hands. And to target Julio Jones, arguably the best wide receiver in the National Football League, a future Hall of Fame player, 4 times in the biggest game of your lives is ridiculous. And then allowing people like Trey Flowers to devastate you on the outside and failing to protect Matt Ryan and adjust to some of the things that they were doing in terms of the pass rush, allowing Dante Hightower's blitz to happen and that forced fumble. It's just, you have to protect your quarterback. And honestly, it ties back to me. You can talk about running game, whatever, blow it out your ass. One way to protect your quarterback is get the ball to fucking Julio Jones more. This is not hard to figure out. How stupid you have to be to think that it is a good game plan to target arguably the best wide receiver in the National Football League 4 fucking times when you've already seen that he's catching everything, no matter how difficult. I mean, we're doing Michael Jackson memes talking about Julio Jones being a smooth criminal on the sideline and all this other shit. The fact that he didn't have 10, 15, 20 targets or touches in this game is ludicrous. I don't care if you got to hand the ball off to Julio in the fucking backfield. I don't care if you throw him 5 goddamn wide receiver screens. I don't care if you put him in as a fucking wildcat. Julio Jones is a difference maker. And you need to put your difference makers in position to make a fucking difference. And this is the stupidity of NFL teams sometimes. They overthink shit and they get too cute. And it costs this team severely. It was also an inability later on in the game to adjust to James White. Once LeGarrette Blount had that early fumble and they kind of went away from him, the Patriots just basically abandoned the running game and said, fuck it, we're going to throw every time. You're going to let Tom Brady throw every time on you. And even though you were getting some great pass rush, especially from a guy like Grady Jarrett, you were just letting James White run roughshod over you. And if you do that, New England's going to take advantage of it. Tom Brady's going to be okay with that. And they're going to make big things happen. You couldn't really defend Julian Edelman. And then at the end of the day, let's face it, for a team that lost 2 Super Bowls because of fluky catches, a team that won another one in spite of the fact that they almost lost a third one because of Jermaine Kearse's fluky catch in Super Bowl 49, they got that incredibly fluky, once-in-a-lifetime type of catch out of Julian Edelman. That karma finally came back for the Patriots. So there's a variety of factors. The fact that sometimes teams get hot, coaches get hot, quarterbacks get hot, offenses get hot, and then you're damned and loath to stop them. And that's what happened with the Patriots. For the Falcons, you had a young and experienced defense that really wasn't that good. At some point in time, the Patriots figured out, yeah, they've got speed, but can they play? And after seeing what happened, the rest of the third quarter and the fourth quarter and into overtime, you really started to wonder. But I think a lot of the blame has to go to Dan Quinn, which is a shame because he's a big reason why they're fucking there. While everybody wants to focus on Kyle Shanahan, it was Dan Quinn's defense that faltered when they needed him. It was Dan Quinn that didn't override his offensive coordinator, which at the end of the day, since he's the head fucking coach, he is the HNIC of all that you see on the goddamn football field in the Super Bowl for the Atlanta Falcons. He could have said, no, this game plan is stupid. No, Julio Jones is on fire. No, they can't defend him. Yes, he will catch every fucking thing. We throw to him. We throw to him. We throw to him. And guess what? Knock, knock. Who's there? Throw to who? Throw to Julio, motherfucker. That's who. A lot of this blame has to go on Dan Quinn because he allowed the offensive game plan to be substandard and ridiculous. And he allowed the defense to get shredded late, which was ridiculous because they shouldn't have been tired. Because how much were they really on the field? How much did the Patriots really test them the first half of the game? I mean, this should have been a dominant blowout victory. That is a big reflection of the head coach, I'm sorry. And the ultimate question comes down to, can they overcome this? The good thing for them is all the key pieces are going to be back on offense. They have a young defense that should get better. And they have the draft coming up that is very good on the defensive side of the ball, where they can get better on the defensive side of the ball. It's all about the mindset, and it all starts with Dan Quinn. Bringing Steve Sarkisian in, is he going to be a quality NFL offensive coordinator? How much of a loss overall is he going to have with Kyle Shanahan not being in the fold anymore? I mean, because he really helped revitalize Matt Ryan's career. A couple of years ago, Falcons fans might forget, but they were talking about Matt Ryan maybe being done. It's time to replace him, and he just won the MVP award. I mean, so it's going to be important for them to have Dan Quinn figure out a way to get this team to put it behind him. Not necessarily to totally forget, but to move on from it and learn from it and be better for it. And I don't know if he can, but I don't know if he can't. Because that's what it's going to come down to. Because they've got the talent, they've got the Jimmies and Joes to get back to the Super Bowl. They could work on their X's and O's a little bit, but again, at the end of the day, it's all about mind and heart. And if the mind and the heart have been ripped out of this organization, it's not going to matter. In terms of the draft, they've got to get better on the defensive line, a defensive end, tackle. They just need more help there. They need more talent there. They need guys that can actually rush the passer outside of Vic Beasley and Grady Jarrett. They need more there. I think the only need they really have offensively, and I don't know how much of a need it is, but it's probably something that would be a luxury if you could improve it, would maybe to get somebody that can play at right guard. But if they don't address that in this draft, it's not a crime. I still think they could use some help in the secondary, both corner and especially at safety. I think they've got their linebacking core pretty well in place. But the number one priority for the Falcons, the number one goal of the program in this offseason is to improve their pass rush. Because when all is said and done, even with some of the guys that performed well in the Super Bowl, most notably Grady Jarrett, at the end of the day, Tom Brady was able to sit there and pick them apart. And if you can get pressure with your front four, It can make up for some of your gaps in instinct and awareness and experience in the back end of that defense. You got to affect the quarterback's timing, and the best way to do that is with a pass rush. And if the Falcons can get a pass rush in other places this offseason, they could very well be right back in position. I just wouldn't put my money on it because, man, this is going to be a hell of a loss to overcome for this organization.